for our fourth stop. This is Dr. Jarrod Miller. He's our extension agronomist, and he's going to razzle and dazzle you about some nutrient management and cover crop research he's doing.
All right, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. We have two projects to talk about. One that ended was 3 years long from the NRCS, and one that's just begun. So the NRCS funded a project here in Delaware where we looked at termination timing and cover crop mixes because they were interested in how much nitrogen might be available from some of these mixes if we add a legume in there. So we had two sites, one down here in Georgetown and one up in Middletown. We had 4 cover crops. One was a plot with no cover crop. We had rye mixed with clover, rye mixed with vetch, and we had 2 termination timings. We did it 2 weeks early and then planting green. And then we had, we planted corn behind one set of plots and soybeans behind another. So we have a lot of data. I'm only going to go through a little bit of it, but we do have a lot of data. So our rye, we planted about 100 pounds per acre. The rye with vetch and clover, we planted 40 pounds of rye and then 20 pounds of clover. And that's important because we'll talk about how much biomass came out of this. Because we did this over 3 years, 2018 up to 2021. Our termination dates for corn were April 8th to May 8th, depending on the year. 2020 with COVID, they kind of prevented us from getting out in the field a little bit, so we're a little bit behind. But our corn terminations were over the month of April, pretty much. And for soybeans, we terminated the cover crops from April 27th to May 29th. So this is important. We're going to talk about how much biomass built up, how much nitrogen was there, and then the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So starting with the corn studies, when they talk about biomass, they mean all the green matter, all the green mass that's in there. So the more your cover crops grow, the more greenery they have on them, the more biomass they have. So if you're looking at building up nitrogen, you want more biomass. If you're looking at building up biomass to prevent weeds from growing, then you want more of that green. That's why you try to terminate later. When looking at these mixes, before getting into this research, maybe you read about cover crops, we would say, well, rye is your biomass builder, and clover, your legume, is your nitrogen. But when you mix these together, even by reducing that rye from 100 to 40 pounds, by adding in the clover, 5 out of 6 site years, so what I mean by site years, we did 3 years Middletown, 3 years Georgetown, so we combine those all together, and so we have 6 site years. It's just a research term to make it sound like we did more work. But rye clover mixes, 5 out of 6 years, had the most biomass. So even though we dropped that rye down to 40 pounds, by adding in 20 pounds of clover, even those earlier termination dates in April, we still got the most biomass, 5 out of 6 site years, by mixing clover and rye together. Vetch did almost as well, had 4 out of 6. Rye itself had 3 out of 6. Now all those were late terminations, being planting green at later April, early May dates to really build up that biomass. So the only time rye itself had the highest biomass was in Middletown in 2021 because we have to haul our equipment up there. If we don't have access to it, if we can't get a truck to get up there, we get up later. We didn't actually plant Middletown until October 27th. So the legume never really grew, and the rye had the most biomass and ends up having the most nitrogen in it. So the problem again, with cover crops, and you're trying to get the biomass or the nitrogen, you got to plant it at the right time, you have to burn it down at the right time, you have to get the right weather for it. The highest biomasses that we ever had was that winter from 2019 to 2020 where it stayed so warm, everything grew out of control here. We had a whole lot of vetch. Even though we terminated about the same time, we had biomasses up to the number of 17 megagrams per hectare because they like metric units. To prevent weed biomass, you need about 8, and we had double that in 17. It was a lot from that mixture. So we had the biomass, but what about the total nitrogen? Rye clover had the most biomass, which means if you have plenty of nitrogen in here, you have the most greenery, you had the most nitrogen 5 out of 6 years. Particularly if you burned it down later. Same thing with vetch, 4 out of 6. And rye at Middletown that year, it had a lot of nitrogen in it in Middletown in 2021, but the C to N ratio was also high. So you get that biomass, you get the nitrogen you're looking for, but then the question is it going to break down and release that nitrogen? Because when you mix rye in there, that's the question, is that rye has a high C to N. It means it has a lot more carbon in it. Microbes in your soil, they want carbon for energy, they want nitrogen, just like a crop does. So if you get those out of balance, that's when they end up stealing it from your soil. If you put a high C to N ratio material out there, you lose your nitrogen you apply because the microbes want the carbon from your rye, but they also want some nitrogen to keep eating it. So they'll steal it from your fertilizer that you might add. So of course rye has a high C to N. It's not a legume. 6 out of 6 site years for corn, it had the highest C to N. Those C to N's went up to 38. If your C to N is around 25 or lower, that means you probably have net nitrogen release. Above 25, you lose it. Rye almost always, whenever we burned it down, was above 25. So it's not always releasing nitrogen. By adding in vetch or clover, a lot of times it's around 12, and that's close to what you might see out of manure. So lowering that rate of rye, adding in some clover, you build up the biomass, you build up the nitrogen, and then that C to N ratio of that mixture together was low enough that we can almost guarantee some nitrogen's coming out of that later in the season. Depends on the weather and how well everything works out. So then the question after that is, well, what happened with the yields? You can add this nitrogen in there, you can have the biomass. What were the effects on yields for corn? There's only one negative effect that we saw with these cover crops. 2 out of 6 site years, if you terminated, if you planted green, we saw lower yields by about 5 to 10 bushels in corn. 2 out of the 6 years. And so probably because we had lower stands in that case. 1 out of 6 site years, in Middletown, we actually had higher yields. And in that case, what we think was sometimes that biomass up there is not irrigated, but it might have kept moisture in the soil. That's our only guess. We didn't have moisture meters up there, so we can't tell you. 2 out of 6 years, we actually had an increase in yield in corn. And in Middletown, we think it was due to moisture, but down here in Georgetown, what we think happened was that rye actually protected that corn from a late freeze in May, because every single plot that had cover crops didn't burn from the freeze, and they all had 20 bushels higher corn than the no cover. It's the only year it happened in Georgetown. Irrigated plots with cover crops here, didn't matter. The point was, for us though, if you're looking for that additional nitrogen, you're looking for that biomass, it didn't ever reduce yields by having a cover crop here. If managed correctly, kill that biomass, get your stands up. So then it brings us to soybeans, where we pushed it even later. We burned down everything later, put soybeans behind it. Same thing, when you have clover and you burn it down even later, those going into the month of May, clover, 6 out of 6 years, highest biomass by adding clover in there. So we always think it was vetch. The vetch stands look so thick, we thought it would be vetch. But vetch was only that high mixed with rye 2 out of 6 years. But what's interesting is, when you look at the nitrogen content, vetch is so much higher in nitrogen that only 3 out of 6 years was nitrogen higher in the clover mix, but 5 out of 6 it was higher in the vetch. And 3 out of 3 of those years in Georgetown. So every year down here in Sussex County, if you had vetch and you burned it down for soybeans, you let it build up, it had higher nitrogen. So for corn, burning down in April, clover usually had more nitrogen. You keep pushing that back into May for soybeans, that's when we saw higher nitrogen with vetch. So that vetch takes longer to grow and build up that biomass and add the nitrogen, but the later we had it, the more nitrogen you saw. Those C to N ratios, when you really push it that late, rye went from 29 to 57, so that thing's definitely stealing nitrogen. But the same thing, even though we burned down that later and we let it build up biomass and the rye grew more with those mixtures, we still had C to N ratios of about 12, which is really good for some of those mixtures, except where the vetch didn't grow in Middletown and we had a C to N of 39. So if that legume doesn't grow, if you don't see it growing, you're going to want to burn down that earlier if you only have rye left, because it's really going to steal from your nitrogen. So for soybeans, 3 out of 6 years, cover crops improved yields, and there was no year where they actually decreased them. We did see some stand issues when we couldn't get our planter into the vetch. So the overall take from this 3-year study was, for both soy and corn, we didn't see detrimental effects. For cover crops, if we managed, if we made sure that we had the planter settings right, got our stands in, and burned it down on time. But early termination for corn, 2 out of 6 years, gave us about 5 or 10 bushels better yield. So 2 weeks ahead of time, but that does change how much nitrogen you get out of the legume at that point. So earlier termination for April also favored clover for corn. So clover was better for early termination, vetch was better for nitrogen if you did later termination. And that's pretty much what we saw at 3 years. We have some soil nitrate data and things like that, but it gets to be too much information to process. So our overall feeling for mixtures versus rye, particularly for corn, is lowering that rye, adding in a legume does give you the nitrogen, it gives you the biomass. It seems to be, at least out of that 3-year study here, to be a win-win just to add in that clover. After that, the management of when you plant, when you burn down would be up to you. The other studies that we're looking at is because rye can steal your nitrogen and because legume might add it, is we've had a couple studies here, and we have a new one that was behind here last year that's looking at different nitrogen rates within rye, clover, and then a rye-clover mixture to figure out what's the agronomic optimum nitrogen rate. So they only have 1-year study. It's being done from New York State all the way down to the south. I think Florida and Texas are growing cotton, but most other states are growing corn in the study. And what they found across all of the data sets was that by having a legume, they actually were able to lower their nitrogen rates by about 30 pounds on average, from 196 to 169. So that's across the entire region. For us, they said that based on the yields we got here, which range from 45 to 245 bushels, because we had the plots with only 40 pounds of N all the way up to about 320 pounds of N. Our agronomic optimum nitrogen rate was about 275 pounds of N out in the field. So this year we had the study over in another part. We'll give them those yields as well, and another 3-year study will try to figure out how much nitrogen comes from legume, how much nitrogen is the rye stealing, and what might be our optimum rate for this region. So that is everything I have on cover crops right now in nitrogen. If you guys have any questions, if I can answer them, I will.
How did you seed them?
How did we seed the cover crops? We drill them here. Yeah.
Were the clovers in blossom when you terminated?
Depending on, like the corn, no. Soybeans, definitely. Yeah. And the vetch was too. By the time we get the soybeans, when you get to late May, you get a lot of blossoms out of the vetch. And we actually had another interesting thing is we had more slug damage in the no cover plots than we did in the cover. I don't know why. All right. Thank you.